Hi, I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Nate.
Probably thought of the command line as a tool for sysadmins and developers writing scripts in the 90s, but CLIs are having a comeback, driven by AI code editors like Claude Code, Codex, and Cursor, and they're becoming the way modern developers build integrations again.
This episode, we're interviewing Tyler Lamparter from Celigo's product team, who led Celigo's CLI solution, to talk about what a CLI actually is, why it matters, and what it looks like when you're building enterprise integrations from inside your IDE or really anywhere that you're accessing your CLI.
Tyler, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Introduce yourself. Tell us something that's not on your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, so I'm Tyler Lamparter here on the product team as a portfolio strategist, and maybe something not on my LinkedIn is 6 weeks into having a kid, so maybe a little bit tired on this podcast, but we're gonna work through it.
Love to hear it. Quick stat for you to react to here, Tyler. Back in March, the co-founder and CTO of Perplexity reportedly said that they're moving away from MCPs and instead using APIs and CLIs. What's your immediate reaction to that?
Yeah, my first thought is like it makes sense if you're, kind of in the space. So like a little bit of context is, MCP servers have kind of been the mainstream way to interact with tools and stuff within for coding agents, right? But you're finding as you need more tools to do more things throughout your workflow and day to day, they're consuming more and more context windows for you. So people have kind of migrated over into using CLIs, which are, the way computers started back 20, 30 years ago when you had no GUI to basically go into, and command line interfaces are just don't blow your context as much, and you can kind of get more done without wasting as much money and credits.
So you mentioned there that CLIs, that's kind of some people think of as a legacy way to interact with computers or interfaces before we had like nice UIs. And of course, CLI stands for command line interface, but maybe even could you go a little bit further explaining kind of in plain language what it means? What is, a command line, and what does it mean when it's like text in, text out as the interface rather than a UI?
Yeah, for sure. So, if I grew up in the GUIs, but for anybody else that grew up pre-GUI era, you start off in the terminal and command line. So you would have, if you've ever had to open up terminal because you're following some how-to to do a particular thing on your computer, you open it up and you've got one little line there to enter whatever you want, and whatever you enter are typically commands, right? It's maybe I need to get into a particular root directory to perform some actions, or in Celigo's case or in Claude's case, right? It's like I want to interact with Claude, so I say Claude, and then it brings me up into an interactive session with Claude. Or in case of Celigo, I would say, Celigo flows list, and then I'd get a list of all my flows in Celigo. So it's just a way to run commands in a terminal and to basically fetch data and to perform actions and operations on your behalf.
Yeah, so when I got my first MacBook, I used to pull up terminal and it used to have it say things back to me, right? That was what I used the terminal for. But now we're obviously talking about using a terminal or an IDE to create something. And then on top of that, we're using it to create integrations within our cloud-based platform here, right? That's the ultimate goal. So what is the relationship between something that's like on your local machine now, you're using CLI and your IDE, and how is it able to access the cloud-based platform? Is that through the APIs, and do you have to have an API layer for that access? Can you kind of walk through what we've done at Celigo and just generally the topic?
Yeah. Pre-internet, all commands, were more local, right? So they were running scripts on your computer or running particular commands to, move folders or files or get into directories, right? But now that you've got the internet and you've got APIs, of course, that have been around for a while, CLI for Celigo looks like, because we're all cloud hosted, it's my commands are really calling REST APIs that are our foundation on Celigo. So if I say, I want to grab errors or flows or something from Celigo, and my command is, let's say, Celigo flows list or Celigo flows errors. What it's doing behind the scenes is, of course, running a script to call our REST APIs to go fetch the data from the cloud and then bring it back down into your terminal, so you can look at it and interact with it. And that's, all in good. But the terminal itself, without combination of having like Claude Code, let's say, is just purely like fetching data for Celigo or modifying data in Celigo, versus the combination of having AI, where of course you can then build graphs and charts and then of course troubleshoot stuff along the way.
And Tyler, when you're typing out like a command or you're designing this as you're talking about CLI, are there commands or functions? Are they one to one with the APIs, or are you able to kind of build additional functionality into the CLI to do more than just what a single API call would do? What's kind of the design thought between what makes it an efficient CLI and how to leverage the APIs correctly?
Yeah. So, you could do all of it one to one, right? Like it's probably the easiest thing to do. And it's probably about what my first pass was through when I built out CLI with Claude Code was, I went through our API docs, which were, we had open API specs for everything that's interacting on Celigo, and then had the quick pass through to create commands basically for all those specs. But as you go through it, you kind of find like, do I need this here or not? Maybe it doesn't make sense. Or could I combine certain things? Like, for example, execution logs on Celigo. First, you go fetch, let's say, details, but you also fetch like request and response logs. So you have like the payloads themselves, but you also have like the network trace, for example. And that could be like 3 API calls, and that could be three commands that you build out. But to make it more efficient, just build out. What I've done is basically just built out one command for that in that particular case. So it's more clear to AI when it's like, what is this command dash help? It gets a reference point, and maybe there's optional arguments that you pass for just that singular command, to have everything in one. So it's a little bit about making it more user friendly. Some of it's more friendly to AI agents so that they don't have to have as many commands to go through and figure out when do I use this versus another one, and kind of architecting it in a way that, again, it's super easy to use for these AI agents to do things on your behalf.
So it's less about like the raw functionality and more about an efficient use of the function so that AI can use it effectively. I think we used to, and when we were using like a GUI or user experience, we used to think in let's make this intuitive for a human to understand what's happening visually. And now with CLI, an effective CLI is not just about raw functionality, it's also being efficient in what you build so that the whatever AI interface is interacting with the CLI, it's also efficient in its credit usage, how it operates. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, like another good example is, let's say I want to clone, in Celigo we have this concept of flows. And if I want to clone a flow, I need to bring my credentials along with me. So in the UI, what it looks like is I clone a flow and then it says, okay, what connections do you want to use for that particular flow, right? And the UI goes and fetches the NetSuite connections or the Business Central connections and then the Shopify connections, right? And you kind of walk through stepwise, right? Like, I want to use these connections. But if you think about like CLI, the command would be clone, but the requirements to clone are I have to pass a connections map of, okay, when I clone, here's the connections I want to use. And so you might have to go prefetch those connections. But what I've done in this case for cloning of CLI is it's oftentimes people are just cloning and using the same connections. And so you can pass an optional argument of just use same connections. And then what it does in the background is it just fetches the list of connections that you're using on the flow currently, and then automatically will pass that back into the clone operation. So it's another example of like combining operations together. That way you don't have to have your AI think as much on the front end how to use a particular command.
And how is the LLM able to determine what the functions or actions it can take with each command? So you mentioned there's a help aspect. So what's kind of the mechanism that it's able to figure out what to do within the CLI?
Yeah, I Yeah, so there's probably a few things. There's like overall like architecture of Celigo terminology and what things are throughout the product. And for that, of course, it's got access to like developer documentation and our Celigo documentation as well that it can, typically just search out on the web for. And then particular for our MCP server, we've got like a search knowledge base tool that we'll probably bring to CLI as well. That way it's just a RAG search against our knowledge base. But, after you search through docs and you kind of get the general concept of Celigo, right? On top of that, it's like you can build out skills to do particular actions. So what we've done is we've actually built out probably about like 20 different skills at this point for things like building flows or building scripts on Celigo or building handlebar expression functions on Celigo. And so whenever you're interacting with Claude and saying, I want to build this particular flow, it'll go grab that particular skill that it needs off the shelf to then figure out what it needs to do. And so there's, some stepwise pieces in there to like look out for this or do this and this. And then it just helps inform AI what to do and what particular commands to use. But even if you don't have the skill, it's typically pretty good at figuring out what to do. The commands themselves have all have help context. So you'll see Claude Code often run like Celigo flows --s help, right? And it'll return back a description of that particular function so that it then knows what to do. And for the most part, the commands have been built out, not super verbose, but fairly verbose enough that you might not need the help description because the command itself is fairly obvious on what it's doing and that you would choose it.
Tyler, just to circle back to something that you mentioned a bit earlier, you mentioned, we grew up in the GUI phase, right? And CLIs have been around for decades. So what's changed in the last year or two that is making CLIs come back?
Yeah, it's really this need, right, to have coding agents have access to tons of different tools for you to perform your day-to-day workflows, right? If I only had Claude and Claude didn't have access to, Celigo or didn't have access to Jira, right, for managing tickets and stuff, then it's kind of, all it's good for at that point is building things locally, summarizing stuff, giving me plans to then I go to the GUI of that other system and perform the action. So what MCP servers and CLI has done for Claude and coding agents, right, is now I can just go perform those actions on your behalf without ever leaving Claude itself.
Got it. So sounds like you're explaining how that the developer experience is being changed by using CLI within Claude Code, Codex, Cursor, etc. What does the loop look like, right? So natural language in, some sort of interpretation. I think you walked through this a bit with Nate. Can you walk us through what that loop looks like?
Yeah, so you would spin up Claude Code or Claude Chat or any other LLM client, right? And you would, of course, assuming you're a Celigo customer, you would go in there and start chatting away. Typical things would be like, are there any errors basically for me to manage for the day? So you'd come in to work for the day and figure out, what do I need to work on here? Of course, I probably have emails sitting in my inbox of notifications for errors that maybe happened overnight, but why not just be directly in Claude? So I'm interacting with Claude and saying, let me know what I need to do start of the day. And then it's going to come back or it's going to go, call commands and go fetch all the errors that are open, categorize them into like which ones, are probably the highest priority, maybe based off of historical syncing for flows or just the fact that maybe it's like an order flow. So it's more important than maybe let's say like an item flow. Categorize those into P0s to 4s. And you can, of course, iterate through. Maybe there's some manual intervention that you need to do, like credentials being down or something like that. Or if it's something it could easily fix, which maybe we can get into a demo later, could show a quick example of like a script gone wrong and it fixing it for you and retrying that all directly from Claude.
Awesome.
So, Tyler, we're talking a lot about CLI, right? It's because of its prevalence, like when you're coding, but there's kind of these two competing ideas out there. We started with the stat at the beginning about how a lot of people are switching from MCP to CLI we have both at Celigo, right? And this is in particular what we're talking about here is the platform MCP. So the functionality that you see within the CLI, it's now offered through the protocol of MCP to interact with the platform, separate from exposing an MCP for use by an agent. Can you just kind of talk about what you think about the two differences between CLI and MCP? Are they one better than the other? Is it more just a preference thing or a persona? How do you kind of determine when one should be used over the other?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, most people could use, like, if you're thinking about like how many people can use one or the other, more people could probably use MCP than they could CLI. So, like, tons of corporations and businesses out there typically lock down computers from running commands and scripts locally on their computers, in which case, CLI maybe isn't a good fit for them because they have that lockdown and restricted. Whereas MCP servers, they're more tightly coupled in with your Claude subscription or your OpenAI subscription. And it's natively baked in, right, to its UI. So your IT department would say, hey, I'm giving you access to use this MCP server. You don't sort of have the same governance over CLI. So in that way, governance would probably benefit MCP servers over CLI. But if you're looking like from a raw developer aspect, who's in Claude Code or VS Code or Cursor all day, or you're used to command line interfaces, then CLI would be the way to go because you're saving on token usage when you're using AI all day, every day. That token usage can really add up because once your context window bloats out and you got to start up new chats, you're saving on token costs, but also saving how long you can extend a chat out without having to create new ones or compact.
So are you saying one's more efficient from a token perspective than the other?
Yeah, CLIs are for sure more efficient.
Is there any, so you might be more efficient in the token usage. Is there any besides the ability to run, CLI locally on a machine being restricted for probably good reasons for lots of organizations? How do you kind of differentiate the controller access? Like I can imagine there's a difference between someone who owns a business process, like they're running the, fulfillment side of the business and they only want to be able to access and manage those flows versus someone who's an admin of an entire platform, right? We're talking very broadly. So there's, so much power within these different ways you can interact with the platform. How do you make sure that the right people have the right ability to do the right things from a security perspective?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good call out because if you're running around with a full access token, it's like a little kid running with scissors, right? Like kind of want to save them from themselves, right? So there's a few different things that we're doing at Celigo to combat this. Of course, now that we're kind of fully headless, and some of those are we've had API tokens historically where it's either full access or can be scoped to particular resources. But further on, or just this week, we're releasing out personal access tokens so that whatever access you have as a user, you can also generate a token and it's access tied to what access and role you have in Celigo itself. So if I can only monitor integrations for errors, then I can still generate a token without having to go get a full access token. And then the only thing I could do, of course, is read errors and integrations, run flows, modify errors and stuff like that to retry and maintain those. And then, of course, we plan to go kind of full scoping and IAM privileges basically on APIs at some point here to kind of further scope more like fine-grained permissions on those personal access tokens. And then outside of that, you typically would do most of this within sandbox environment. So, once you build everything in sandbox, you would, of course, then pull that down to production, probably in the GUI itself, but you could do it from terminal as well. But, maybe if you're looking to segment access or like making sure you're doing the right thing, kind of do everything in sandbox and then still go maybe to a traditional GUI to pull down.
Sure. And so, Tyler, I've been messing around with CLI. It's very exciting. It's kind of like magic to see it. So I recorded a demo here. I'd love for you to kind of react to. I'll share my screen and maybe you could just talk about what's going on behind the scenes as someone who's been kind of in the weeds of building and leading this. I'd be curious, I'm seeing it from the user's experience, but I'd love to get your reaction to this. So we in the platform, right? We have this concept of lookup cache, which is this reusable place you can store data. Um, you can fill it out, and it can be used across the platform to like reference something. So common ones are like state initials or currency exchanges or something like that. And of course, in the UI, I could just upload a CSV. But what I did here is I actually ran this in to generate a lookup cache for me. So you can see I don't have a lookup cache at all in the UI of the Celigo platform, and I'm just prompting uh, Claude Code here to create a lookup cache for me. Um, what I liked about this was it's not only doing the action in the UI, which is honestly not that many steps, but it's going ahead and getting the data for me, which is the US states, right? Otherwise, I'd have to put into a CSV or find some data source and then upload. So, you know, the Claude Code experience is it's referencing a lot of things, and I can see it's made correctly here. But if we go back and look at the actual UI here in Claude, can you kind of show me, kind of talk about what are these commands I'm seeing? What does it mean? What's happening? Obviously, I see the end result, which is what I'm excited about, but what's actually going on here? What's Claude Code saying here when it's running this?
Yeah. So that first one would be, it's exploring what tools or commands it's got available to it, right? So you can see it ran two commands, and probably one of them was what commands do I have? And then it probably drilled down into the lookup cache ones, or maybe a couple of the lookup cache ones to then determine which is the right one to use. And then it found it, and it of course then generated all the states behind the scenes automatically for you. And then it also knew it had previously it found that create lookup cache command, right? So it created that lookup cache, and then separately called the like upsert data command. So there's two different commands for lookup caches: one to create the lookup cache itself, and a separate one to go upload the data and put data. And so yeah, it was finding what commands it needs to run and then ran them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. And then the next one I did, right, I created a flow, which is the one that's very exciting, right? It's, not that it's hard on the platform, but it would take me the time to go through, look at all this, design it. I basically provided it a very simple prompt, right? Just natural language. I want to sync my Business Central and Shopify customers. And it was able to do that. Now, what's different about this one is if I pause it here, it's asking to allow something. So this maybe if you're one of those people who's vibe coding, which I've certainly found myself in, you're annoyed by this. You're like, just do it, just finish it. I don't need you. I'm asking you for a reason, but like, what's going on here that it's prompting me? Is this a good thing? Should I always hit allow or allow once? What's kind of your thought about this?
Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of how people have guardrailed um, agents from doing actions that they shouldn't do. And so the idea here is, and this isn't unique to Celigo, it's any CLI out there, right? Whenever Claude Code wants to run some command or call some tool or search the web, right, it's going to ask you first for permission, depending on the mode that you've got it set in. So in this particular case, you'd see, a list connections is probably a super safe command to run. It's just listing out connections. So in this particular case, I probably would always allow. But when you get into cases like, update a flow or update an export or import or connection, in those cases, probably you'd want to do allow once, so that just for this particular point in time, I'm allowing this command to run. But then any subsequent times it wants to run that command, I would have to still give permission. That being said, I'm now often just in auto mode so that, um, if I'm working in Sandbox and I can easily revert back to a particular thing, I don't have to sit here often and click allow, allow, allow. I'll just be in auto mode and have another chat window up, probably doing something else.
And this isn't something that you've built into the CLI. This is Claude that is prompting this up to come up based off of the criteria that it's generating when it's running this. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Whenever Claude wants to run some command, it'll come up and ask.
What I actually thought was really cool about this was I really gave it very little instructions
Hmm.
and I just said I wanted a flow generated, and it actually knew to put it in the tile. So I had a couple tiles here. I had already generated one flow with CLI for Shopify and Business Central. It asked me, I basically went through and prompted it, and then it put it into the flow, into the tile that I wanted, which is really cool. So again, it's like sometimes you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of that. It's like it's super powerful and made some decisions by itself. In this case, it was really convenient for me, and it was what I wanted. But maybe providing more strict instructions can be valuable for what you're doing, especially when you're building a big project. That's something that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. And oftentimes you could also go into like a plan mode and plan some of this ahead. So instead of being straight into like build mode, you could, if you swap Claude into plan mode, you could plan out the thing that you want to build first. And so it would probably come back and ask some clarifying questions of, should I include this in this particular integration that already exists? Do you want me to use this connection that already exists? Stuff like that. But part of the way it was able to do this in the first place is it had access to those skills that were built out for building flows, which within them, say to, check for integrations first before creating new ones, and searching like the marketplace, for example, for like templates out there that it could utilize and reference for context for itself to build what you're trying to build.
And Tyler, for an enterprise developer or a partner team that's looking at implementing the Celigo platform, what's this change about how they work day to day, or on each new project that may come on their plate?
Yeah, it's been interesting because I rarely go into Celigo or other UIs anymore. Like since I'm a product manager, I'm in Jira. I have to use Jira fairly often, right, to get status updates and to create new ideas and process insights that customers and stuff have that we want to work on the backlog and roadmap. But for the most part, I'm only going into Jira and Celigo when I need to, or if it's always nice to visualize things sometimes, right? But for the most part now, if I'm like updating stuff or checking on statuses for things, I'm just sitting in Claude and asking, and I can easily switch context between doing something with Jira or doing something with Celigo. It's very good at switching context for you to know what you're doing and what you want.
Got it. And how is this specific process? How's this different than building one-off scripts, or Nate brought up vibe coding earlier, which I think we all dabble in here and there. How's this different?
Yeah, it's different because I think it's one thing to vibe code something and build something, but it's another thing to get it into a production state and shipped. You'll, now that you've got Claude, everybody can build almost whatever they want. But getting it into a state that's production ready and actually deploying it out is a completely separate things. And so it's, you'll see a lot of people build stuff that sitting on the shelf, right? Because it's like, who wants to maintain it? They don't know how to get it to production and deploy it. They don't have documentation for it. They don't have, all the stuff you need additional outside of just the prototype and the build, the consistency with the rest of the platform, the thought and architecture behind those commands, right? I built out all the commands, and in those examples that I went through earlier of combining APIs together, that was my knowledge of Celigo, then refining it. So I took the time to go refine it. But somebody that's just purely vibe coding often, isn't going to kind of go into that level of detail and refine what they need and productionalize it.
When I was messing around, I was very interested in like the build phase of the platform, which it's obviously very powerful. It simplified it a lot for me and had a good result. But there's so much more you can do, and we emphasize, especially with Celigo, the ability. It's not just about build; it's about you have to maintain integrations in the future. With CLI, are you able to also do that maintenance phase? Is it also convenient? And where does like the line begin and end of the CLI or working in Claude? And then where you would kind of see maybe you still need an interface. Like you mentioned, you don't spend a lot of time in interfaces anymore. It's like when do you go into an interface?
Yeah, I'd say it's when I want to go into an interface, it's just because I want. It's just nice to look at something. It's like sometimes you get a little bit of reading fatigue at this point now that AI content can easily be generated, and it's honestly kind of nice sometimes to go to nicely made interface and look at stuff versus reading a transcript every time.
Very old school of you, Tyler, to want a UI. That's no longer.
That's why he has the white hair and his beard like I do.
Yeah, yeah.
That might be fatherhood, but
So Tyler, when you talk about maintaining these instances, is that also a place for CLI to work? And then I think what's nice is for people outside of someone who's just a customer of Celigo, like from a partner perspective, they might be dealing with multiple Celigo instances. So can you maintain the platform and can you maintain multiple instances of Celigo with CLI?
Yeah. So the nice thing about the way the CLI has been built out is you can create multiple profiles to go against. So for partners of Celigo, or customers that have multiple environments, what this means is you basically can make different profiles for different environments and set default profiles. And so for partners, if there's common things that they're doing across customers, or they want to, a common one that partners do is like, account health. Somebody's had Celigo for 3 or 4 years, and it's been passed over maybe between employees or different departments or something, and then they want somebody to come in, right, and give an account health or like overall status of Celigo. That'd be like a very common, let me run this skill that I've made to go figure out what's this account looking like, right? And because they can access multiple profiles, they can easily just toggle back and forth between them. So that would be one difference also than compared to the MCP server route is for MCP servers, you would have to set up multiple MCP servers to access multiple environments and multiple accounts and with different API tokens and stuff. So the CLI route does make it quite a bit easier when you're working in multiple environments, multiple accounts.
And Tyler, do you have an example of that management that you could walk us through?
Yeah. Let me share my screen real quick. All right, so let's do a live demo here and see how it goes. All right, so fresh chat. You can see my peak hour of work is 1 p.m. and it's just about 1 p.m. So it's like prime time here to work in Claude. All right, so let's see, what are the latest errors in my Celigo account, right? So it's doing a little bit of thinking.
And Tyler, you said my Celigo account, and it's going to know which Celigo account because you only have one profile right now connected through CLI. But if someone was using it to manage multiple, they would need to specify which account.
Right. Yeah. In this particular case, my default profile is my personal like sandbox account. But yeah, if you wanted to use other ones, then you would just specify use, or what are my latest errors in account XYZ, whatever you've named your profile essentially. So you can see what it's doing here is it fetched the troubleshooting flow skill, which is one that we've created basically to run through typical things that you would look for when troubleshooting your particular Celigo flows and what errors they might have. So the two commands it ran was a top level Celigo CLI help. So you can see it returned back basically top level commands that are available for CLI. And then it found a job subcommand. So it recognized that jobs are the execution object basically within Celigo, and thinking that, it probably would find errors in recent jobs that ran or something like that. And so there you can see it ran a jobs list with the filter criteria of created date. So it probably passed in a filter of jobs and then fetched them. And you can see a few of my profiles here with some, of course, hidden tokens. And yeah, again, my
Tyler, it's only able to fetch this stuff, one, because the API exists, but two, it's like the infrastructure has already been built in the platform, right? It's like because error management is built into the Celigo platform, it's easy to one, expose that as an API because it's core functionality, but then connect it to the CLI to then use it in this interface. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. And you can see I actually just pushed out an update last night for 2026.6.1, and so you can see I basically went through, since we're now GA, and went through and fixed all the commands to make them all consistent between them. Simple things like singular and plural commands or nouns and verbs and stuff like that. Might have been able to choose a quicker model here, but I typically am just running on 4.8. All right, looks like we're about getting there.
Maybe double click on that, Tyler. It's the performance of this is not the performance necessarily of the CLI, it's the performance of the model you're choosing, right? It's, if you want to use a more powerful model, you might have a different experience. And
correct, yeah. Yeah, it's thinking through what it needs to do, basically, right?
yeah. And we get this question a lot. It's, Celigo is offering the CLI for our platform, but you do need a subscription to an LLM within a code base or Claude Code or any of the embedded like LLMs to work with this.
Yep. All right, yeah, so you can see it came back. And this is, of course, where we we keep iterating further on the skills that are available, right? And maybe consolidation of commands or making descriptions of commands better so that maybe it could have found it more faster, right? If I had, built more into the troubleshooting skill or something, for example, or modified its rules a little bit. So it's kind of like iterative, right? And it's fairly easy to iterate, given that skills are mainly markdown files that we can modify. All right, so you can see here it came back with some flows that are live, and this is my demo one. The sync customers, where I had a script error basically. So I've got 5 errors, and in this particular case, I didn't anticipate phone numbers not being there in the data, and so some of the data in here did not have phone numbers. And so the script was initially handled in a way that, didn't allow phone number to not be there, essentially. And then the second one, of course, is just a connection down issue, which this would be one case where maybe you go into the UI and fix the connection versus doing it from CLI. Like maybe I'd have to go to Shopee or something and go grab a new API token. And then I could give it to CLI to upload. But for like security reasons, maybe you don't want to do that. And so you would just go to the UI in Celigo and then update your API token directly in the GUI.
But you could modify the script right within the CLI for that first error, right? To account for the error, and then without ever leaving us, you could resolve this.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where I was going to go here is let's fix the first, or let's fix the 5 errors on that flow. And so typically what it will do, and hopefully here live it does what it typically does. It'll go through and find, what is the script. Let me go get the content of the script itself. So you can see, it's going to load up this script writing guidance skill. So again, we have another skill for writing out scripts. And it'll fetch that script content itself here probably shortly. All right, it's going to get that import ID. And then from that import ID, it'll find the script ID that it needs to go fetch. All right, so it found it there. And now it's going to fetch a failed record so that it can basically determine why did this failed record not make it through the script, and then kind of marry them together. So you can see this get retry data. There's a particular command for flows errors where you pass the flow ID and the step ID and then the error ID to then fetch that retry data. So you can see basically exactly what the payload was that was running on that particular step on Celigo before it failed. All right, so it fetched the script. Extracting phone values basically out of all that data to see what it looks like across those 5 records in particular. All right, so yeah, it came back with its root cause, right? The script does, it's fetching the first part of a phone number and then trimming it. In this case, there was no phone number, and so it correctly identified what the problem was. it'll go update that script and then actually call the command to retry those errors. So you can imagine like doing this across your entire account, like throughout the day, or partners doing it for customers, right? They could just sit in Claude all day and troubleshoot and manage errors. And they, of course, could go into different chats while this is running in the background. So, of course, I don't have to stay here and see what it's doing the whole time. But the idea is I start off this instructions command, let it go to town, and then I come back if it needs something from me.
And Tyler, what do people need to do if they want to use Celigo's CLI?
Yeah, so if you want to use it, you can go to developer.celigo.com/CLI, and there's instructions on how to install it. There's a full list of command references that you can see as well to see what all commands we have available for CLI. And then we're constantly adding to it as we update our APIs in the back end. It basically flows through at this point from API layer to CLI and MCP.
Awesome. And we're about out of time on today's podcast or episode. So Tyler, what's something that you're building? Like, what's a project that you're excited about? Doesn't have to be technical. It could be something that you're building for that newborn as well.
Yeah, so I guess when I'm not building in Claude all day with virtual things, my side gig is building furniture. So I've got some woodworking projects that I've been doing. Like earlier this year or last year, I built a bed for us, and now I'm kind of working on the nightstand. So should have two nice solid walnut nightstands sitting next to me here pretty soon.
Amazing.
Place to rest your laptop while you're working in Claude, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tyler, thank you for joining us. We will definitely have you back on the podcast. And thank you all for joining us on the airs.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.